Welcome back to another edition of Diamond Star Stories. As you can see with the cards that are presented before you, we're actually going to be touching on the man once voted as the best player in White Sox franchise history in 1970, Luke Appling. So without further ado, let's look at the 1936 Diamond Stars Luke Appling, card number 95. This is part of the 1936 series, as cards, at least in the 90s and above, were all part of the third and final year that they produced the Diamond Star cards. So as a result of it, this card's actually a little bit more scarce than cards you'll find in Series 2 or even the Series 1, which were released over 34 and 36, by and large, with a few exceptions. So this card has a little bit of significance in a lot of ways for Luke Appling too. Not only was it his only Diamond Star card, but it was the year he actually had his best season overall, where he batted, at that time, a career high of .388 and was second in the MVP to somebody in the Yankees named Lou Gehrig. So whoever that guy is, he finished second to that person. But let's back it up a little bit and talk a little bit about Lou Gehrig, and we'll get an opportunity to look at the card too. So he was born in 1907, lived a ripe old age of 83. He actually was a left-handed thrower who converted to right-handed because he wanted to be able to play shortstop. So that's something kind of unique that I found out about him. He was born in High Point, North Carolina. He later returned to the South when he passed in Georgia later on in 1991. When he was in North Carolina, he went on to attend Oglethorpe College, graduated from there, and played in the Southern League with the Crackers for a little bit of time. Was scouted briefly by the Chicago Cubs, was signed by the Chicago White Sox, and then debuted later on at the age of 23 with the Chicago White Sox, where he proceeded to play until the ripe old age of 43 in 1950. He was voted into the Hall of Fame in 1964. Let's talk a little bit about his career. So he had a nickname of being Lucius Luke was one of his nicknames, but the one he's probably more commonly known as was Old Aches and Pains. And this was a name that was given to him by his teammates because he would often kind of complain of one ailment or another that he was feeling, so that he picked up that name. And it's a name that's kind of stick on with him throughout his history. When you talk about Old Aches and Pains, everyone knows you're talking about Luke Appling. So if you didn't know, that's what that referred to. It actually is referring to the White Sox shortstop. He had a career 77.5 WAR and a career .310 average. He actually hit over 300 for 9 consecutive seasons. He had a break in his career in parts of all of 44 and most of 1945 when he was with the Army. Otherwise, he probably would have reached 3,000 hits instead of finishing with 2,749 hits. He was a 7-time All-Star, a 2-time batting champion. His other batting title was in 1943. When he batted .328 and was also second in MVP to another Yankee named Spud Chandler, obviously a little less known than Lou Gehrig. He was also a player that actually had a lot of consistency well into his later years. At his 43rd year, he didn't obviously do all that well, and he was nearing retirement at that point. He was a part-time player, but the previous years, when he was 41, 40, and 42, he hit over 300 for all those years. He was mostly a singles hitter. That was one of his sort of weaknesses if you look at his Hall of Fame credentials, but he also was a guy that walked a lot, so he was on base a lot. So he had a lot of things that you kind of look for now, minus the power that you'd want for somebody that batted leadoff, even though they moved him on to the third and fourth position in the lineup because the White Sox teams he played for were terrible. He never played on any pennant-winning team, was never really in a pennant race during his time. This was still sort of in the aftermath of the White Sox scandal in some ways, where the White Sox teams were really bad, they were depleted, and they had a hard time replenishing their farm system for many, many years. He just missed when the White Sox started getting good again in the 1950s, and actually had a chance to play with some of the players that went on to be part of the Go-Go White Sox. Upon his retirement, he held a few career leaders. He was most games played at shortstop. He had the most double plays at shortstop. He also had the most putouts and assists at shortstop, which was for the American League, which was later broken by another American League White Sox player, Luis Aparicio. He was kind of known as a guy that was pretty quick with his glove and had a lot of range, but he made a lot of errors too. So even though I think he had kind of a reputation of being a good fielder because he could get to a lot of balls, he still made a lot of errors and had the most errors and worst fielding percentage at the time of his retirement for any player since 1910. So that's one thing that kind of knocks him down a peg at that point. He probably was a little past his prime in the field when he still played shortstop and maybe needed to move to another position, which is probably what they would have done now, or moved him on to designated hitter. But he stayed at shortstop well into his twilight years when he was in his 40s. After his career, he stayed involved with baseball for a long time. He was a minor league manager, won 2 pennants as a minor league manager, including it was named Minor League Manager of the Year in 1952. Despite that, he never really got an opportunity to be a manager in the major leagues, and the only time he was able to sniff that was in 1967 when the A's let go of Alvin Dark at the end of the season. So he only had 40 games where he was able to be a manager, and he only won 10 of them. That's right, 10 of 40 games. So his winning percentage was only 25%. So you can see why he probably wasn't retained as a manager at that point. But he was also a guy that was just really well liked. So he was a coach for the various organizations throughout his career, including Cleveland, Detroit, Baltimore, the A's, and the White Sox too. And then was a spring training instructor near his home in Georgia with the Atlanta Braves. As I mentioned, in 1970, he was named the greatest White Sox player of all time by the Chicago chapter of the Baseball Writers Association. So that was a great honor for him. And I think he kind of held that title until probably Frank Thomas came around and probably eclipsed, in my opinion, definitely eclipsed him. One of his also things you can still look up on YouTube that's an interesting note was not something he did during his playing career, but it's something he did after his retirement. If I was a kid, I still remember this back in the early 80s. You'd see a lot of these old timers play old timer games, and this kind of lasted for a while into really kind of the early 90s where that became less a thing. I know the Yankees still do it, but they were legit games sometimes they would play. But this was the Cracker Jack Old Timer game in 1982, which was at RFK Stadium in Washington. He was age 75, and he hit leadoff for the American League, and he hit a home run at the age of 75 off of Warren Spahn, a player he probably didn't get a chance to play during his career unless they maybe met up in an all-star game after the war. But otherwise, he was able to hit that home run, and you can look it up on YouTube, and he just has the biggest smile on his face as he's kind of trotting around the base as best he can at that point. He eventually passed away when he was receiving an emergency surgery in 1991, unfortunately. So he passed away at that time. And his legacy is kind of missed in some ways in White Sox lore. The Go-Go Sox definitely have a huge following up to this day, including myself. And the teams that sometimes happened after it, like the 83 team, 93 team, the 2005 team, are always going to be remembered amongst my generation. And then we also sort of looked at the Black Sox in some ways, because they were a team that became very popularized during my lifetime because of the movie 8 Men Out when I was much younger, and it's kind of lasted on because of the likes of Shoeless Joe Jackson. But the teams outside of that, a lot of the players aren't really kind of remembered, including even their 1906 World Series team, apart from maybe Ed Walsh, who's someone that kind of gets mentioned from time to time. But Luke Appling was a legitimate star for the White Sox, and I don't really know why. The only sort of notation of him that you really see when you walk into Guaranteed Rate Field is his number being retired up there, which is important, but it's up there for every player that has his number retired. And they also have statues along the outfield at that stadium. If you've ever been there, and they have statues of Frank Thomas, they have statues of Paul Konerko, they have statues of a really cool one actually of Aparicio and Fox turning a double play, Minnie Minoso, Carlton Fisk, a lot of the guys that you would kind of anticipate to be in there, including Billy Pierce as well. But a really omission in my mind is that they never did a statue for Luke Appling, and I don't know why. There's no good reason in my mind that they haven't honored him. And maybe even gone as far to be able to put a statue up there for Ted Lyons as well, and some of these other guys that kind of were played during the 1920s into the 40s. You could even put one for Eddie Collins up there for all I care, because he was a good White Sox player, even though people more remember him with his time with Philadelphia. And that just little era is kind of missing in White Sox lore, and their best player is not represented in sort of any other way other than his number up on the wall. So that would be my one plea, I think, for the White Sox. Not that they're watching this video, but maybe for White Sox fandom, if you can find some way to band together to be able to kind of petition the White Sox to put a darn statue out there, keep the lungs out there with all the other great White Sox players, and he's just missing in there. And it's really, as you can see, it bothers me in some ways as a fan of the White Sox and a fan of baseball history. So anyway, I promised to look at the card a little more closely. As you can see, this card is just full of all the colors you'd kind of expect from the Diamond Stars that they're pretty famous for. Here you can see a player kind of warming up in the bullpen, and then probably somebody behind him kind of coaching him while he's holding on to a bat. Looks like he's kind of just swinging a bat, getting ready to go to the plate or loosening up for a game. Is kind of how we kind of often think of this photograph of him, or this obviously picture of him. It's not really a photograph. But you can see I love this uniform because you can see the White Sox logo on there, even though it's partially covered. But it's a uniform that I think is one of their best one in their history in my mind, and one I wish they would kind of bring back a little bit more often and tributes in ways that they honor these old teams from the White Sox history. And I think it's just got a really colorful front. I was really happy to pick this up recently, and I face shooted it before. So this is like just kind of a retread, I guess, if you will, of a card I pulled out in the last couple months. But on the back here, we have the blue ink that you see on the 36 Diamond Stars, as well as like a little bit of information about how he did that season. But then they kind of talk about, I believe with this one, they talk a little bit about fielding, if I'm not mistaken, on this one as I kind of read through it. So all these Diamond Star cards, as I've kind of mentioned before, have little tips for little future major leaguers that are playing like T-ball and things like that. I don't know if they had T-ball, but Little League Baseball at that time. And in the back it mentioned this was he batted .307 in 1935. And again, he batted .388 during this season. So just a really good example, I think, of this card. Because of this little mark here, it obviously brought down the grade on there, which ended up being perfect for me to be able to pick up such a great copy of this because the registration on here is so clear. It's not centered perfectly, and that's just okay. I mean, this card is from 1936, so you have to give certain allowances for cards that are that old. So that's Luke Appling. I hope you guys enjoyed this edition of Diamond Star Stories, and we will be back soon.